I would like to ask Aneta Zahradnik to be our next guest. She is PhD candidate at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna and Doc Fellow at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. She also studied art history in Vienna and Berlin and graduated with a diploma thesis on the relationship of artistic production and labor in her work on Francis Ives. She worked as the research assistant at the Department of Art History at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, researching a collection of Habsburg portraits from the 18th century, which resulted in the publication of the catalogue. Since 2017, she has been writing her PhD thesis on conceptual art practices under socialism, with a special focus on the conceptualization of art in the 60s and in the 70s in former Czechoslovakia. And now, welcome Aneta, and we are going to listening to very important speech about Austrian-Czechoslovakian relationships. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the friendly introduction and also for the invitation. I'm really grateful that you invited me. I feel kind of honored, actually, and I'm very excited. I will dive right into it and hope to stick to the 20 minutes. The Czech artist Jiří Valoch and his Austrian colleague Heinz Gappmayr from the mid-60s on, and until Gappmayr's death in 2010, stood in a constant dialogue through letters, collaborated on several occasions, and met personally, especially after 1989. They developed a special relationship where private friendship and professional collaboration intersected, and which was characterized by a deep appreciation of each other's work. Both were very active and well connected in a network of concrete and visual poetry. An essential part of their dialogue was the regular exchange of their artistic creations, which had in common to be situated on the threshold of visual poetry and conceptual art. This tendency of a conceptualization of concrete poetry is also very much reflected in both their theoretical writing, which shows strong ties to concrete and constructive art. In the conference's framework of regional cultural transfer, I'm going to investigate the material and immaterial flows between Valoch and Gappmayr in form of letters, artworks, art publications, personal networking, and theoretical discourse. I will touch upon aspects of the significance of language and translation in their practice, the approach of internationality and universalism in concrete poetry, and a certain aesthetic language of visual poetry and conceptual art they appropriated. First, I'd like to address their exchange on a material level, taking into consideration the specific materiality of the so-called dematerialized art practice of conceptual art. The media employed, such as typewritten text, printed matter, graphics, or photography, for transporting ideas and concepts on sheets of paper, could be easily transferred via postal service. And Laszlo Béke, I wanted to add here, he characterized in his comprehensive text on conceptual tendencies in Eastern Europe the quality of the media employed as a certain, I quote, poorness. They were ideal means of communication across geographical distance, across physical and political borders. In the 17th, this was not only for Valoch, but for Gappmayr as well, a possibility to participate in the international art scene and to overcome a personal isolation they found themselves in. Valoch, because of the repressive situation of the normalization period after 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and Gappmayr, because of a still quite conservative atmosphere in the Austrian cultural sphere. Although from such politically antithetical regions, what they had in common is a certain separation from the main art centers and both actively wielding influence from the periphery. Both lived and worked outside the capital cities of their countries. Gappmayr in the relatively small town of Innsbruck in the western part of Austria, and Valoch in the city of Brno. According to Helena Musilova in her fundamental monography on Jiří Valoch, Gappmayr and Valoch started to exchange their artworks from the mid-60s on. Thanks to such interactions, also due to his activity as a curator at the House of Arts in Brno from 1972 on, his far-reaching international contacts and his continuous collecting efforts, Valoch accumulated an impressive number of artworks by artists from inside and outside the Eastern Bloc. Today, his collection and archive is divided between the Moravian Gallery in Brno, the National Gallery in Prague, and a private collection in Zagreb. Correspondence, magazines, catalogs, artists' books, mail art, etc. are mostly located in Brno. It served as the main source for my paper, and I want to say it's quite one-sided because the Heinz Gappmayr private archive it's not accessible for research yet, so I had quite limited, but at least I had some insight into the archive of Gappmayr via email correspondence with his daughter, Gabi Gappmayr. Valoch and Gappmayr communicated in German. Due to his fluency, Valoch had even graduated in German studies. It was his preferred language for contacts abroad. It enabled him to establish strong connections to the German-speaking cultural scene, particularly to gallerist Armin Hundertmark in Berlin or fellow artist Klaus Groh in Germany. Even with some of his Hungarian colleagues, such as Laszlo Lackner or Geza Pernetsky, he corresponded in German. This knowledge opened for Valoch a wider territory of action. And at this point, I want to refer to Catalina Cevarga's paper, very inspiring paper at the First Resonances Conference, where she referred to philologist Jürgen Erfurt, who pointed out the significance of language as constituent for space. We could consider Valoch's multilinguistic competence as the basis for the possibility of communication, being I quote, symbolic power and market, end of quote, by Erfurt. Erfurt also emphasizes the significance of technologies like printing, radio, etc., that have increasingly deterritorialized language. Linguistic artifacts, books, texts can easily circulate across borders and be distributed globally. The earliest letter by Gappmayr in Valoch's archive dates back to December 1970 and is exemplary for how exchanges between the two ran off. Gappmayr thanked for receiving Valoch's optical book and Book About Nothing and announced the mailing of his books Zeichen 2 and Zeichen 3, which were published a few years earlier. Gappmayr made his first book Zeichen, which means signs in English, in 1962. A small square format with black lowercase lettering on plain white paper. He stuck rigorously to this minimalistic aesthetics in all of his artists' books. Valoch considered Gappmayr's early books as, I quote, the most radical pole in the field of visual and concrete poetry of the 60s. In Zeichen 2, he used solely the word sind, which means R in English, and exercised variations of one theme by only changing slight nuances. He pushed the reduction of linguistic material to the extreme and created one-word texts, conceiving the syntax of the surface of the sheet of paper as constituent of the text. Gappmayr was 20 years older than Valoch. He was born in 1925 in Innsbruck. Located between Germany in the north and Italy in the south, contacts to the cultural scenes of Munich or Turin were likely. He had his first solo exhibition at the so-called Studio Und in Munich, an art space founded by German concrete poet Wolf Wetzel and painter Reimer Jochims in Wetzel's apartment. The studio has been described as a private, and I quote, uninstitutionalized initiative, a loose grouping where personal friendship and appreciation of similar art developments were the most important tie, end of quote. Wetzel ran the associated edition Edition und, where Gappmayr from 1968 on published several artists' books. For example, the book Raum, which means space in English, in 1977, consisting of blank pages only. Valoch realized a very similar concept 7 years earlier with his book about nothing, 54 blank pages except for the word nothing written on one of them. And I've already showed the book about nothing with the first letter. So we know that Gappmayr was in possession of this book, for sure. It was through Gappmayr that Wetzel approached Valoch in 1977 in a letter mentioning that Gappmayr showed him some of his works, which he found very impressive. And he added in a second letter, I quote, "Especially on the threshold of concrete art and concept art, your works are one of the strongest I am aware of," end of quote. In 1983, finally, the two collaborated, and Semantic Study, an English translation of the original Semantická studie from 1975, was published within the Edition und. Besides working with translations of texts like here, Valoch produced from very early on independent pieces in English. In 1971, for example, the work 8 Concepts, which consisted of single words like some, somewhere, something, and so on, written on each page. He was not only interested in the structure of English language as such, but also used its potential to reach a wider and international audience. His life partner, Gerta Pospišilová, she was director at the House of Arts in Brno, and the professional translator of English, supported him in this regard to a great extent. Gappmayr never realized independent texts in other languages than German, but he worked with translations and, in 1971, for the first time, pursued a multilinguistic approach. In his text Transparency, he typed the word in German, English, French, and Italian and laid open the process of translation of a word that is almost identical in all 4 languages. Later, in the 80s, he produced additional English, French, or Italian versions of originally German text pieces. For example, the work Gegenüber from 1971, realized as Opposite in 1985, and several years before that, in 1979, realized as his first text installation, In Fronte, in an Italian gallery space. In a text from 1987, Gappmayr outlined the universal approach of understandability of visual texts. I quote, "The reduced verbal material in visual texts allows transcending the limits of immediate understanding set by different languages. Visual poems are universally understandable in their original form, like the visual arts and music," end of quote. He was deeply influenced by Eugen Gomringer, Swiss writer and one of many founding participants of the international concrete poetry movement. In 1954, he published his manifesto, From Line to Constellation, where he declared, I quote Gomringer, "The constellation is the simplest possible kind of configuration in poetry, which has for its basic unit the word. It is inter- and supranational. The constellation cannot be translated. Its meaning is literal and unique," end of quote. Concrete poetry's claim for internationality and its worldwide development is reflected in the many anthologies compiled. One of the first was Experimental Poetry by a Czech author couple Bohumila Grogerova and Josef Hirschal from 1967. It is also one of the earliest occasions where Gappmayr and Valoch both participated. An essential part of distribution and networking happened through joint publications as such, through magazines, editions, artists' books, or graphic prints. Other meeting points of Gappmayr's and Valoch's work in publications were, for example, the English poetry journal Tlaloc in 1965. It's in the first row in the middle. The Anthology of Concretism, published in 1967 in the Chicago Review. Paul de Vree's Poesie de Fusie, published in 1968 in Belgium, or Maurizio Nanucci's Exemplar, Documents of Concrete and Visual Poetry from 1970, published in Florence. Early exhibitions both participated in took place in Ferrara and Piacenza in 1968, in Zurich in 1970, in Amsterdam, Nuremberg, and Stuttgart in 1971. This list illustrates quite vividly their extensive geographical interrelations. In Austria, the magazine Neue Texte, New Texts, edited by artist Heimrat Becker from Linz, was such a forum for experimental poetry. For the fourth issue in 1970, Valoch was invited to do a compilation dedicated to Czechoslovak experimental poets. Under the title, A Private Anthology, he selected pieces by Ladislav Novak, Biela Kolazhova, Milan Adamczak, and many more. The correspondence between Valoch and Becker is exemplary for how the networking via letters and publications functioned. They exchanged issues and text and transmitted addresses of colleagues interested in collaboration. Neue Texte was also a platform for the publication of theoretical writings. In 1972, the German philosopher Siegfried J. Schmidt published his manifesto, Conceptual Poetry. He observed the development of 60s concrete poetry towards a second phase. Quote, from the experimental concretized to the conceptual concrete linguistic texting. And Schmidt writes further on, quote, while visual poetry reduces the semantic dimension to possible structures, conceptual poetry presents a nuclear conversation universe. The recipient comes into play by being, quote, a creative participant in a complex aesthetic communication process, end of quote. Schmidt outlined the special role of Gappmayr in this development. He was an important collaborator for Gappmayr and dominated the theoretical writing on his art throughout the decades. In the 70s, Schmidt also corresponded and collaborated with Valoch as material in the Brno archive documents. Valoch as well observed a certain development of concrete poetry and addressed the necessity of its changing in an interesting statement written in 1971 for the 5th issue of the British magazine Contexts. And I quote Valoch here. Yes, we need new poets, but not poets working in the old categories of concrete poetry. We need visual, concrete, spatial action, etc. Poets working in as many different ways as possible. If we can no longer make old concrete poems, we can make minimalized one-word poems in the nature poems, life poems, action poems, project poems, process poems, non-verbal semantic poems, poems for realization, etc., etc. We can find new possibilities between visual poetry and concept art. In opposition to some of my friends, I'm interested in concept art and find some authors, conceptualists, very fine, e.g. Antonio Diaz. I mean, concrete poetry is not dead, but it is no longer only concrete. New poetry is living. This statement already indicates Valoch's definition of conceptual art in its broadest sense, which is also very much reflected in his diverse art practice. In his texts of the 70s and 80s on the subject of visual poetry, which were published 2 years ago in a comprehensive volume by Ondřej Chrobák and Jana Pisarčíková from the Moravian Gallery, Valoch repeatedly stressed the conceptualization as its dominant characteristic and detected a certain, I quote Valoch, contamination of conceptual art. Valoch's occupation with these relations between visual poetry and conceptual art found a further expression in the exhibited section Texti Visualne, which took place in 1976 at the Galleria Labyrinth in Lublin as part of the Offerta 76 festival. And Tomasz Solewski already showed a bunch of material, which I'm very thankful because I couldn't get my hands on the Offerta posters and so on. So I show you the exhibition catalog from 1978. Because the exhibition was repeated 2 years later in Łódź, expanded by a colloquium with lectures, presentations, and discussion. The festival consisted of several sections, such as photo art, film and video, or contextual art. Valoch had been invited by Józef Robakowski to commission the visual text section. Actually, Valoch's contribution took the character of a mail art project. He contacted around 100 artists from around the world, asking to send works in the format of an A4 page to the address of the gallery. Gappmayr received his invitation letter. 3 minutes? 3 minutes, yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, okay. Well, then I skip that. Maybe we can talk about that later. And I conclude. Finally, I'd like to address, shortly, the certain aesthetic language that Gappmayr's and Valoch's artworks share. At some points, they simultaneously arrive at almost identical pieces, like in this comparison, the visual text Horizont by Gappmayr from 1971, and the text installation with the same name of a concept from 1970 by Valoch, which was executed in 2015 at the Moravian Gallery. Also, in some of their photographic works, there are striking similarities, for example, in Gappmayr's Rising Falling from 1979 and Valoch's Cesta from 1974. Both use the camera here in a very objective way, like an apparatus for scanning or measuring space under certain predetermined principles. What I'd like to argue is that the existence of networks and dialogue, which I aimed to illustrate with the archival material I've shown, is evidenced in the aesthetic analogies of their artworks as well. This grounds on the conviction, and Susanna Bilova generally pointed that out in her dissertation on the networks of art between Western German and Czechoslovak artists in 2017, to consider these joint projects as a support and a result of a dialogue where cultural and aesthetic patterns would be transferred. I think in this process, Valoch and Gappmayr perceiving themselves very much in the tradition of concrete and constructive art is crucial. Valoch was a member of the so-called Club of Concretists and very interested in constructive principles. Gappmayr was fascinated by constructivism. He admired Mondrian and Malevich, and he very much identified with their aims and ideals of clarity, reduction, and objectivity. Their preoccupation with constructivist ideas is most evident in the repeated appearance of the motif of the square, using it as the representation of the most neutral form, but also as an art historical reference. They took a constructive approach by working with the materiality of language, using letters and words like geometrical elements. In their visual texts and artists' books, they consistently used lowercase lettering and continued an avant-gardist tradition, which was invented in the 20s and 30s with new typography. The minimalistic aesthetics of black lettering on white paper, the preference for geometric sans-serif typefaces, and the consciously dominant white space, understood not as blankness but as an aesthetic component, were in favor of cleanness, readability, and neutrality. The art historian Anne Thurman-Jayes, and I close, referred to concrete poetry in regard to its worldwide distribution and diversification as, quote, the first global literature based on aesthetic principles. Artists all over the world worked with language as a medium and found a common aesthetic idiom, end of quote. In extension to that, I'd like to address conceptual art as an aesthetic language where literature and visual arts intersect, a common topos a vast number of artists were participating in. In this regard, I find it essential and necessary to look at those, and I quote the organizers of the conference, microsites of cultural transfer. Sorry for the rush at the end.
Eruption. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry again.